The GH7 is out, but does a micro four third sensor make sense in 2024? Do all the bells and whistles that they put inside this camera actually make a difference? Well, I'll hopefully answer some of those questions in this video. We're going to look at some of the new features, the updated autofocus, the IBIS, as well as the headline-grabbing inclusion of the ARRI Log C profile. We're going to look at who I think this camera's for and finish by looking at what hints this camera might be giving us about Panasonic's next major flagship camera. So if that sounds interesting, stick around. I've got a long history with the GH line of cameras and micro four thirds. First camera I shot on professionally was the Panasonic AF101.
Wow.
A micro four thirds compact cine camera. Eventually I picked up a GH4 for myself, and that was the first camera I ever bought myself. If you go back to the very first upload on this channel, you'll find it's a GH4 sample footage video. In recent years, the cost of full frame cameras has obviously fallen dramatically. So that's added quite a lot of stiff competition to this micro four thirds GH line, because now we are quite spoiled for choice with cameras, especially large format sensor cameras and also cameras that, are jam-packed with video-centric features. Can a micro four thirds sensor still appeal to the masses? So I took this camera on my recent trip to Palermo on a holiday to Sicily, Italy, to shoot some sample footage, get a feel for it. I always like to take a camera abroad with me on these little trips to document it. And after using it, I've got a lot of thoughts, so we're going to go over those now. When I first got this camera, I was a little taken back by its size. I seem to remember the GH series, especially when I had my GH4, as being fairly compact cameras. This thing is pretty chunky considering it's got such a small sensor in it. So if you were used to shooting on something like the S5, this camera is quite a lot bigger. You've got a very big hand grip here, which adds a lot of chunk to it. And you've got this sort of slightly larger articulating screen. So it's a newer screen so you get this extra dimension of rotation. Despite all of that, it is an incredibly comfortable camera to hold in the hand, and that's thanks to this hand grip here. And they've done an amazing job on the ergonomics of this camera. It just feels great. The buttons are also all in the right place. So my thumb was just, you can trigger record three ways: with the shutter button, with this record button up here, with your thumb. There's another record button just there. It has definitely been designed very carefully and very specifically for video shooters in mind. It boasts a full-size HDMI, USB Type-C. Also has two card slots, except one is an SD card slot and one is a CFast Express card slot. I much prefer the addition of CF Express because I feel like SD cards are horrible and plasticky, easy to lose, easy to break. And the CF Express cards just feel a bit more robust and unlock faster recording data rates. So that's what allows, high resolution RAW, high resolution ProRes. The GH7 offers an almost overwhelming range of recording formats. You've got compressed media, you've got ProRes, and you've also got ProRes RAW. But the headline is that you get ProRes HQ and ProRes RAW up to 5.7K at 30 frames a second, and you can go up to 5.8K for free open gates up to 30 frames a second, and that's in a compressed 10-bit 420. And you can also get up to 120 frames a second in 10-bit 420 in 4K. Again, no crop happening when you go for those higher frame rates. It can shoot 240 frames in full HD, but honestly, quality of this footage isn't really up to scratch, so I wouldn't really consider using it. What's also cool and worth noting is that unlike the Lumix S5, the micro four thirds sensor is sort of more square, so it has a 4:3 aspect ratio when shooting open gate. So that's often more beneficial for people shooting in anamorphic and for cropping. So it's incredible that Lumix has squeezed raw recording ability within this camera and different flavors of it as well. So there's ProRes RAW and ProRes RAW HQ. But I do wish we were seeing B-RAW in these cameras for a few reasons. ProRes RAW is only usable natively in one editing software, that's Final Cut Pro. The color grading tools in that software just aren't really up to sort of advanced users. They're not up to spec, they're very basic. And most people who I believe are going to be shooting ProRes RAW are going to be wanting to, use advanced features that are found in Resolve to color and treat their footage. So capturing in ProRes RAW then means you have to bounce it down to ProRes or another format and bring it into Resolve and then potentially bring it back. As soon as you bounce it down to ProRes, you lose your RAW features. So the ProRes RAW image on this is absolutely stunning and very flexible with what you can do in post, but I work in Resolve now. I moved from Final Cut 10 to Resolve a few years ago. I think B-RAW is a far more popular and versatile codec because it is compressed. And I just think there are probably more people who regularly shoot in B-RAW and work in Resolve than maybe there are in ProRes RAW. You can output a RAW signal from this and you can still obviously record B-RAW to over HDMI. So that's still an option, which is nice, but just having that flexibility of being able to record B-RAW internally would have been amazing. And I think potentially it would allow them to shift a lot more of these cameras if they were doing that. Maybe there are, legal financial reasons why. Blackmagic is pushing their own cameras very heavily now with internal B-RAW, and so maybe that just wasn't an option for Lumix, which I can understand. But in an ideal world, I would have loved internal B-RAW functionality in a Lumix body. I would probably just opt to shoot in ProRes HQ, which is what I did for the majority of my trip. I was either shooting in compressed media or on one of the days I stuck to shooting in ProRes HQ. That the flexibility and the quality of that footage was, good enough to work in Resolve and was a worthy trade-off of not having those RAW features but being able to work in my preferred editing software. Being able to shoot 10-bit, 120 frames a second, uncropped, is fantastic. Obviously, you can't really do that on the Lumix S line of cameras. I noticed maybe there was a slight hit to dynamic range when filming this. I mean, obviously you are in a 420 codec rather than a 422, so you are capturing less data. But, side by side, exposing properly, the footage looks identical to footage shot in other codecs. And it just looks fantastic, and it's a huge amount of fun to shoot in these higher frame rates. Another great thing is that the dual phase autofocus system works in this high frame rate mode, with one caveat in that tracking is not enabled. I think when people are shooting these high frame rate mode, they are going to be tracking probably fast moving subjects where tracking would be really useful, but I imagine there's some sort of computational limitations that prevent that from happening. So for the most part, you shouldn't have much trouble keeping things in focus, even in those higher frame rates. So one of the things I first noticed when I moved to Lumix S5 from the GH5, a camera I'd shot with for a couple of years, is that it just had this massive boost in sort of image quality and dynamic range, particularly in its highlight roll-off. The GH7 obviously has much improved image quality and dynamic range over the 5 and the 6, but I still found that I didn't quite have as much latitude and it wasn't quite as forgiving as the Lumix S5 cameras, which is understandable. You've got a much smaller sensor in there compared to a much larger, more sensitive full frame sensor. I'm very used to just eyeballing exposure now on the Lumix S5 cameras. I don't really need to use waveforms and stuff like that. But with this, I definitely had to have those on for the first few days, because the first day I went out, you can see here in some of these footage, I was just sort of shooting it as if it was a full frame sensor, and I got a lot of the footage back, and we were in quite bright, challenging environments. You can see a lot of the sky and the sun, which is completely blown out. So the next day, I had to just make sure I stuck my waveforms on the monitor and just made sure I was keeping everything in check and those highlights in check. So if you are shooting in high contrast scenes or something with changeable lighting, it's just something to bear in mind, especially if you are coming from those larger sensor systems. So the native ISO, I believe, is 500. And that's also as low as you can go on the ISO increments, which I did struggle with when I was in Palermo, where it was super bright. On the S5, I can go down to about 320, so I definitely missed the ability to just sort of bump the exposure down on this thing. The GH7 has what's known as a dual gain output sensor. That's not to be confused with a dual native ISO sensor that's found in cameras like the Lumix S5 and S5 II. In frame rates up to 60 frames a second on the GH7, you have the option of a dynamic range boost mode, which gives you essentially, I believe, an extra stop or two of dynamic range. On frame rates over 60 frames a second, this is disabled, and you'll get a hit to dynamic range. This dynamic range boost also impacts sensor readout speed, so with it enabled, when you're shooting 60 frames or lower, you will get a slower sensor readout speed, and as an effect, greater presence of rolling shutter artifacting. The The S5 has two native ISO levels, 640 and 4000. They basically have two image processing pipelines and more aggressive noise reduction applied at the higher ISOs. You don't find that on here. It does mean that you're not going to get the sort of same crazy high ISO experience or performance out of this, because it is a smaller sensor. You know, noise is something that is probably going to creep into your image a lot sooner than it would on a larger sensor. One of the big surprises and headlines that followed the release of this camera, I think on day one of its announcement, was the inclusion of ARRI Log C profile, recording profile, color profile, as a paid £200 update, I think. It's a big headline. Will it make a big difference to a lot of people? Well, yes and no. I mean, the inclusion of a second log profile on the camera is kind of unusual, but it does open up avenues for this camera to be used in, you know, higher end productions, whether you're using this camera as a crash cam, a B cam or a C cam. Maybe you've got one or two other ARRIs on set, but you need a third smaller camera for pickup shots or gimbal work. This is going to make this camera a very interesting proposition for that kind of work. For the casual user, you know, is it worth upgrading to ARRI Log C? I'd say probably not. You know, Vlog is a fantastic log profile. It's very robust. It's one of my favorites. It's not going to necessarily add this whole extra layer of quality onto your productions just for the sake of it. Remember that ARRI Log C is a log profile that's designed specifically for ARRI sensors, and you haven't got an ARRI sensor in this camera. You've got a much smaller sensor in this camera. I don't have an ARRI camera to compare this to, but I have seen the comparisons online, and it's very impressive how close the color science is in this camera compared to those larger cameras. From what I've seen, the ARRI Log C pushes a little bit more magenta in here, and there's some tonal saturation differences. But from what I've seen, those can fairly easily be tidied up with a few nodes in Resolve. Here's a quick side-by-side comparison of a scene shot outside with Steph. To my eye, I found that the ARRI Log C pushes a slightly brighter image to Vlog. Again, I think I prefer working with Vlog just because I feel like it's probably slightly better tuned to the sensors and the Lumix cameras than the ARRI profile. Probably the main benefit of using ARRI Log C is that it allows you basically to use the ARRI look library. These are a bunch of LUTs that are free to use, to be used with ARRI log profiles. They're what's known as log-to-log LUTs, so you apply them before your Rec. 709 transformation. And there's a huge library of these, and it makes it very easy to create quite sort of sophisticated grades and looks with the addition of just two LUTs. And the fact that these are all free and easily accessible, you can go try them out now whenever you want. These are all just basically two nodes in Resolve with maybe a few exposure tweaks. So that's really cool. There's a better selection of these available for the ARRI Log C color profile than you know, is available for Vlog from Panasonic. With Vlog, you're probably going to have to pay for LUTs like the Phantom LUTs, whereas these are, you know, automatically available to you. And there's a huge selection of them, and they're all sort of designed for professional and commercial use. So Lumix cameras have long had fantastic industry-leading IBIS, and it's no different with this little thing. You get the very competent IBIS in the sensor, and then you get the whole host of stuff like anamorphic IBIS, which is tuned specifically for different anamorphic squeeze factors. And then you get the more recent updates that we've seen with the E-stabilization. So these cameras now have a high E-stabilization mode. E-stabilization is basically real-time software stabilization that happens on top of the stabilized sensor. And it works fantastically. It crops in on your image, so just bear that in mind. But what you can achieve with E-stabilization on your footage is, you know, next to God level stabilization. It is a few steps away from what you can achieve with a gimbal. So I put this to the test when I was in Palermo at the food market, and I started stalking moped drivers, handheld, and the quality of the footage is incredible. So for dock shooters who work in demanding environments, running around, capturing stuff on the move, travel videographers and stuff like that, it's going to be really cool. With the standard IBIS, I did notice some warping in the corners, the sort of usual warping and jello that you would expect from stabilized sensors that struggle to sort of compete with wider focal lengths. Zoom in a bit and those sort of warping and jello disappears, which is good. And again, activating the E-stabilization completely fixes that, removes those issues. So if you are shooting at much wider focal lengths, you know, same advice I give for people shooting on the S5 series of cameras, whatever the equivalent focal length is on the Micro Four Thirds, anything under 30 millimeters full frame equivalent, the IBIS system is going to struggle with that. One other caveat with the E-stabilization is that I did find it really struggled to work with the higher frame rate shooting. So I shot a bunch of this 100 frames a second footage and found that I was getting all these weird micro jitters, and most of this footage was unusable as a result. I don't know if this is something that can be fixed in firmware, or whether this is just a limitation of the E-stabilization and how fast it can work when capturing these higher frame rates. I almost wondered whether this E-stabilization was sort of amplifying or introducing these shaky micro jitters, because they didn't seem to be present when it wasn't activated. So that's something to be careful with, something to look at. For now, I would recommend disabling E-stabilization, or at least setting it to the lower setting if you are going to be shooting anything over 60 frames a second. So it's great that this camera comes with the dual phase autofocus. It works fantastic. It works with all the, you know, historic and older Micro Four Thirds lenses. It brings with it the more recent updates that were brought with recent firmware updates to the S5 Mark II line. And it is a very competent autofocus system. It's not quite up there with Sony and Canon, but Panasonic have been chipping away at it over the last 18 months and consistently delivering updates and refinements and improvements. And so for the, you know, life cycle of this camera, I would expect Panasonic to deliver a couple more updates that continue to tweak and refine and improve on the autofocus system. And, you know, let's hope that they can bring it up to the standards of Sony and Canon. You know, I think it's just a matter of time, getting these cameras in more users' hands and, you know, finding where all the issues are. The new system has a sort of huge selection of categories of tracking, from cars, animals, and humans. But when it encounters something like, you know, leaves or inanimate objects or backlit objects, it can struggle to decide what it wants to focus on. So lots of times when we're in the botanical gardens and shooting flowers, it definitely struggled with focus on a number of occasions and misfocused as well, which at times was quite frustrating. But generally, you know, I'm a manual focus person. I use autofocus as a bonus, as a backup. I would always be slightly wary of sort of 100% relying on an autofocus system. I still don't trust it enough to use it during interviews, and I have a whole collection of manual focus lenses anyway. I kind of feel with the trade-off of having a smaller sensor that you should be seeing huge benefits in sensor readout speed, rolling shutter, motion capture on these cameras, because one of my big complaints with the Lumix S5 and Lumix S5 II series is that they don't have great rolling shutter performance. You know, it's not world-ending, but it's enough as a Komodo shooter with a global shutter to notice it and to be slightly bothered by it. You know, whip pans, fast movement, action, sports, they all have rolling shutter issues, and the GH7 has better performance than the Lumix S5, but it doesn't sort of blow it out of the water, which I kind of hoped it would. And like the Lumix S5s, when you shoot in the higher resolutions and open gates, the rolling shutter performance does seem to degrade and become worse. Most people aren't going to notice it, but I had sort of hoped for something a little bit more impressive from this thing. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about now is this sort of sensor size, full frame, large format look, and, you know, why a lot of people will probably dismiss the GH7 without giving it the proper attention it deserves. Now, when I had GH4, I had a speed booster that pretty much sat on that camera, and with that on, that got me back to like a 1.4, 1.5 crop, I think, which was, you know, effectively Super 35 and sort of, you know, mitigated some of the issues that you might have with a smaller sensor. You know, increases your ability to get shallow depth of field, gives you slightly better low light performance, gives you an extra top of light and that sort of thing. And I think for many people, that's one of the major trade-offs with a Micro Four Thirds sensor, is not being able to achieve that sort of cinematic look, that sort of razor thin depth of field. Metabones now make a 0.64 times speed booster. When you chuck that on, that gets you back close to full frame. So I think it gets you to about a 1.2 times crop. With that, you do mitigate a lot of the small sensor size issues that you might have. Unfortunately, at the time of recording, EF lenses adapted through the Metabone speed booster don't seem to gel very well with the camera's new autofocus system. In fact, the autofocus doesn't really work at all when adapting EF lenses with this adapter, which is a huge shame. But I have heard a rumour that apparently Metabones will be updating the firmware of their speed booster adapters to accommodate the GH7's new autofocus system. So fingers crossed that comes through and we get the same excellent autofocus performance that we also see in adapted EF lenses on the S5 Mark II. I shot mostly on the 11 to 25, which is 1.7, and that looks great. I was shooting wide open a lot. In fact, I had to stop it down quite a lot because it was so bright in Palermo. So next, I'm going to show you 3 different shots. All of them are going to be shot at 18mm on different lenses, but still at that focal length. First shot, we have the GH7 with a micro four thirds mount lens, the 10 to 25 Leica f1.8. Up next, we have the Sigma 18 to 35 on the Metabones 0.64 times speed booster, and then finally the Lumix S 18mm on the Lumix S5 2X. As you can see, the speed booster does a great job at increasing the field of view and getting us closer to that sort of full frame equivalent. If you are looking at the GH7 for the first time as a first time buyer and you're sort of confused by sensor sizes, you know, I probably would say maybe you are better off getting, you know, an S5 on the cheap than investing in this system to avoid disappointment or, you know, not being able to achieve that sort of look you might want when you're first starting out. But, you know, a lot of news, E&G, nature and wildlife, a lot of narrative. It doesn't require razor thin depth of field. And all the extra features that this camera brings are going to be very useful to those types of projects or those types of shooters. So thinking how you're going to expose this, you know, using speed boosters, going in with your eyes open, I think you're going to be fine. There is no doubt that the GH7 is the best micro four thirds camera that Panasonic have ever released. In fact, it's the most advanced camera that Panasonic have ever released. And I think in a sense it's a shame that this camera is perhaps a victim of its own success. It hasn't been killed off by the advent of bountiful, cheap, full-frame sensor cameras. But it does mean that Lumix and Panasonic users are sort of divided into 2 camps now. There are the micro four thirds users and there are the L-mount users. And perhaps the biggest shame with this is that there is no mixing and matching of lenses between L-mount and micro four thirds. Now I get it, there are technical limitations, but I wish there was some gadget or gizmo that would allow you to use L-mount lenses on micro four thirds cameras. And yes, you can use adapted lenses and EF lenses on these. You don't benefit from the amazing autofocus improvements that the GH7 has. It's one of the curiosities of the Panasonic line, you know, like Sony has its FX3, its FX30, they're all E-mount. But you know, the upside of the micro four thirds mount is that it's a well fleshed out ecosystem. These cameras have been knocking around for well over a decade now. There is a huge range of micro four thirds mount lenses from multiple manufacturers. They're supported by third-party cine lenses. You know, many of the releases from Lauer, the recent Argus lenses come in micro four third mounts. I believe you can get the Nightwalkers. Even when many of these lines don't support the L mount, they come in micro four thirds mount. The other benefit is that, you know, the micro four thirds lenses tend to be smaller, they tend to be lighter. So the 70 to 200 equivalent for this is, you know, smaller and lighter than a 70 to 200 that fits full frame cameras. In terms of pricing, you know, this isn't the cheapest Panasonic camera, and I think that's also going to divide and potentially confuse people. It clocks in body only about £2,000, $2,000. Although the GH7 is fantastic value for money, for what you get in this for £2,000 is, you know, it's a steal, frankly. Many of Panasonic's own full frame offerings, which are also incredible value, are, you know, up to £500, $500 cheaper than this, you know, S5 Mark II and probably the S1H, even cheaper if you get them used these days. So it's gonna give people a very hard time, I think, deciding, because, you know, of the lack of compatibility between the 2 systems. You sort of have to pledge your allegiance to the micro four thirds mount or go down the L mount route, which again is a shame. It is a fully fledged out, competent video-centric camera, and I think the people who are going to be in the market for this know they're going to be in the market for this and are very sort of aware of what these cameras are capable of and the limitations. So I think it's very difficult to write the GH7 line off. I think these are tiny juggernauts of cameras. However, it does make me wonder whether all these features that we've seen emerging from Lumix in their cameras over the last 18 months have been sort of serving as a sort of training ground for the next Lumix flagship camera. We've been seeing gradual iterations of stuff like the IBIS system, the autofocus system, and now we've seen stuff like the implementation of internal RAW, a new 32-bit audio module, and of course the ARRI Log C color profile, which makes me think Panasonic have slowly been road testing all these features so that they can improve them, so that when they finally turn up in whatever next flagship camera they release, they're going to be fully tuned and ready to go in a sort of killer camera combo. But you know, that's just a theory. There's always going to be another camera around the corner, but that next flagship camera could be, you know, another year away for all we know. If you do decide to pick up this little juggernaut, I'll have an affiliate link down below. I really appreciate it when you purchase stuff from those links. It just helps support the channel and cover my time that goes into making these videos. Let me know what you think of this camera in the comments down below and what you think of it relative to the other L-mount cameras. I think it's really interesting. There was a lot of interesting debate on the Lumix S9 video I put out previously. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. There are plenty of Lumix related content across this channel. But that's it. I'm Ed. Thanks for watching, and until next time, see you later.